And so over the last several weeks, we have looked through the letter and studied Paul's teaching to the church on relationships in the church, relationships within families, and how to live out the Christian life together in the local context of church and culture. And as we near the end of 1 Corinthians, Paul shifts his focus to the life in the body of Christ, functioning together in ministry, functioning together in worship, in the operations of the church. Last week, Pastor David took us through chapter 12, where Paul was teaching on spiritual gifts, using the illustration of a body and how we relate to one another as parts of the body to edify the church, to encourage other believers, and for the glory of God. And so what we're left with at the moment is that God has saved each of us. If you're a follower of Christ, God has saved you on purpose. Your salvation is not an accident. But He also saved you for a purpose. And a part of that purpose is that He saves us into the church to function in the body with gifts to serve the church. If you don't know your spiritual gift as a follower of Christ, we would highly encourage you to find a spiritual gifts inventory to take. And if you look back on the app into the sermon notes from last week, Pastor Doug had in there an inventory that you can click on and take that. And again, it's not exhaustive and it's not gospel in and of itself, but it will begin to show you where you are gifted to serve the church. Nobody becomes more important in the church because of a certain gift. Chapter 13, he's saying, look, the spiritual gifts are going to mean nothing without this higher way of love. Now, chapter 13 is often read. We most often encounter chapter 13 at weddings, do we not? And that middle part of chapter 13 is read as an encouragement and a challenge for the bride and groom to express their love for one another as they enter the marriage relationship. And it's romantic and it sounds good. And when you actually break it down, it's not wrong. But 1 Corinthians 13 was not written in romance to brides and grooms. Chapter 13, Paul is actually reprimanding. He is admonishing. He is correcting and teaching the church at Corinth on the use of gifts with this most excellent way of love. So in chapter 13, we have less of an emphasis on gifts and the individual who has the gifts, and there's more of a focus on love and grace. Chapter 13 is about the supremacy of love. The Greek word that Paul uses here for love is agape. If you've studied this passage or any of the love Bible studies, there's 4 Greek words for love, most often used. And agape is the deepest. It's that unconditional love. Agape love is this. It is a pure, willful, sacrificial love that intentionally seeks the welfare of all others. It's not simply a brotherly love. It's not an erotic love. It is a self-sacrificing, it is selfless for the welfare of all others love. You might be the boss, you might be a great father, but without love, you can be mean. You might be a man or a woman of great faith, walking closely with the Lord. You do the right things. You serve the church. You're here every time we open the doors. But with love, you are nothing. You might have extensive Bible knowledge, be the best Bible teacher we have at Celebration, but without love, you are arrogant. Might be one of the pastors, one of the ministers, one of the directors here at the church. But if we don't have love, then we're nothing. You might be a missionary, a pastor. You might simply be ready to lay your life down for the sake of the gospel. But without love, you have gained nothing. Gifts without love are worthless. Your acts of service without love are worthless. Ministry without love cheapens the minister and the ministry and the church. The gifts are about the church of Jesus Christ, and we exercise our gifts in love for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the church, for the sake of the mission of God, for the sake of the glory of God. Love is the greater gift. Paul personifies love here as a person who acts in the ways that Christians should imitate. When I was a teen, so other than at weddings reading this, when I was a teenager, I can remember in a Bible study being instructed to write my name, to substitute my name in for love. Scott is patient. Scott is kind. Scott does not envy or boast. Scott is not arrogant or rude. Scott does not insist on his own way. Scott is not irritable or resentful. Scott does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Scott bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now, if you know me at all, my family was in the last service. If you know me at all, Scott's not very patient. Scott likes his own way. Scott can be pretty prideful and resentful. Paul uses these positive and these negative things here. Love is patient, kind, rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. The negatives: doesn't envy, doesn't boast, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not selfish, is not irritable or resentful, does not rejoice in wrongdoing. As a minister, as a Christian, you might have heard this as well. You might be a Sunday school teacher, small group leader, you serve in some way. But at some point in time, you might have been told, as servants, we should minister out of the overflow of our hearts. We should minister out of the overflow of God's ministry in us. Well, you know what? I don't know about you, but I got a bunch of holes. If I sat around and waited until I felt full of the love of God in order to minister to others, whether that's in the church or outside the church, might be in my own home. If I had to wait to love my wife as Christ loves the church until I was full of the love of God or feeling full of the love of God, my wife would never be loved. If I waited until I was full of God to answer the call to preach when David asked me to, I would never be on the platform. And over the last couple of weeks, as I was preparing for today, it hit me. I'm not a cup waiting to be filled and overflow in order to minister to others. We are conduits of the love of God. We are vessels. We are channels of the love of God. It's not God overflowing in us. It is the love of God through us that fuels us. The thing about a conduit is, as the water flows through it, it still wets the conduit. it leaves the vessel wet. And so the love of God ministers both to the vessel and through the vessel.